She had spent 23 years being invisible. Tonight, they made sure she felt it. In the middle of Chicago's most glamorous ballroom, surrounded by crystal chandeliers and people dressed in wealth she could never touch, Evelyn Ashcombe stood alone while her cousin pointed at her and laughed, and the whole room laughed with her. What Vanessa Holloway didn't know was that the quiet girl she just humiliated in front of Chicago's elite had already saved the life of the most dangerous man in the city. And he remembered everything. Like this video, and drop your city in the comments. Let me show you how far this story travels. Follow the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single part of this. The dress was wrong, and Evelyn had known it the moment she pulled it from the back of her closet. Not wrong in any dramatic way, no torn hem, no embarrassing stain, but wrong in the particular way that modest things become wrong when placed alongside expensive ones. It was dark green, knee-length, bought 3 years ago from a department store that no longer existed, and it had been her nicest piece of clothing for so long that she'd stopped noticing its quiet failures. The fabric that didn't quite drape correctly, the zipper that required 2 hands and a specific angle to close, the way the color sat slightly flat under bright lights, like a leaf pressed between book pages until all the life had dried out of it. She noticed now. Standing at the entrance of the Holloway Grand Ballroom on the 32nd floor of one of Chicago's oldest luxury hotels, Evelyn noticed every single thing wrong with herself and her dress all at once. The way you sometimes notice a crack in the ceiling only after the plaster has already started to fall. The ballroom was enormous, and it was full. Wall sconces threw amber light across a sea of women in gowns that cost more than her grandfather's monthly rent. Men in dark suits with cufflinks that caught the light like small, expensive fires. A string quartet played somewhere near the back, their sound threaded through the conversation and the clink of glassware. And waiters in white jackets moved through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of people who had learned to navigate wealth without disturbing it. Evelyn stood at the entrance with her small clutch held in both hands, like something she might need to throw. She almost left. The thought was immediate and physical. A tightening in her chest, a slight lean backward toward the elevator doors that had already closed behind her. She could go home. Tell her grandfather it hadn't felt right. He would understand. He always understood. But she had promised him she would try. That word had been the deciding one. Not go, not enjoy yourself, just try. As if her grandfather knew that enjoyment was too large an ask, but that the attempt itself might be enough. So she didn't leave. She adjusted her clutch, straightened her spine in the way she'd trained herself to do when crowds pressed in from all sides, and she walked into the Holloway Winter Gala alone. Hassan. The invitation had arrived 8 days earlier, slid through the mail slot of their 2-bedroom house in Wicker Park with Vanessa's signature on the inside. Looping and deliberate, the kind of handwriting that had been practiced. The cardstock was cream and heavy. The embossing left small ridges under Evelyn's fingertips when she ran her thumb across the lettering. She had stared at it for a long time before showing it to her grandfather, Arthur Ashcombe, who sat in his usual chair by the window with his tea going cold beside him and a paperback detective novel open across his knee. At 71, Arthur had the particular dignity of a man who had been worn down by the world without being flattened by it. There was something still upright in him, something that hadn't bent even after the failed business, the medical bills, the slow erosion of the savings they'd both spent years building together. He'd read the invitation twice, folded it along its original crease, and set it on the armrest. "Vanessa," he said. "Yes." "When did she last call?" Evelyn thought about it. "Christmas, 2 years ago." Arthur made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite judgment. He picked up his novel again. "You should go," he said without looking up. "Not for her. But there will be people there. Business people. People who know other people. Your work deserves to be seen, Evie. Not just by collectors who find you through the back pages of an antiquarian catalog." Evelyn's work was book restoration. Antique volumes, damaged spines, water-warped pages, foxed and faded covers that other people had given up on. She had a small studio in the basement of their house, converted from what had been a laundry room with specialized lights and humidity monitors, and a collection of tools so precise that some of them had to be ordered from craftsmen in Italy. She was good at it. Better than good. She had a reputation in certain circles. The quiet, paper and leather circles where old books were treated like living things that deserved careful medicine. But those circles were small, and the money that came from them was inconsistent, and her grandfather's pension covered less than it once had, and the roof had leaked for 2 winters running. She went to the gala because he was right, and because she was 23 years old and tired of being afraid of rooms. For the first 40 minutes, it was merely uncomfortable. Evelyn found a glass of sparkling water at a passing tray. Not wine, because she needed her wits tonight, not social lubrication. And she moved through the edges of the room with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years being neither seen nor heard. She listened to conversations she wasn't part of. She looked at people and tried to read them the way she read damaged books, looking for the structural cracks beneath the decorative surface. She saw Vanessa once across the room, laughing at the center of a small constellation of women, and felt nothing specific, just the dull recognition of someone she shared blood with, but not much else. They had grown up in the same extended family orbit, but rarely the same houses. Vanessa's branch of the Holloways had money the way some trees have height, naturally, abundantly, without apparent effort. Evelyn's branch had had it once, briefly, and then hadn't. She didn't approach. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment, but what she was actually doing was postponing the specific discomfort of being looked at by Vanessa's group and found wanting in some visible way. She was, it turned out, postponing the right thing for the wrong reasons, because Vanessa found her first. Ishgat. It happened near the dessert table, which was where Evelyn had drifted as the evening wore on. Not because she was hungry, but because the dessert table was near a corner, and a corner gave her something solid at her back. She was looking at a display of small chocolate structures arranged on a mirrored surface when she heard her name said in a voice designed to carry. "Evelyn, you actually came." She turned. Vanessa Holloway at 26 was the kind of beautiful that required maintenance. Not natural beauty, but cultivated beauty. Expensive and precise, like a garden that would die in 3 days without the right care. Her gown was deep burgundy, off-shoulder, and it cost more than Evelyn's monthly income. She was smiling, but it was the smile of someone who had already decided the outcome of a conversation before it began. Behind her were 3 women and 2 men, all approximately their age, all arranged in the posture of people who were used to watching performances. "I did," Evelyn said. "Thank you for the invitation." "Of course." Vanessa's gaze traveled over her in a single movement, start to finish, the way you scan a shelf for a specific title and find a book you don't recognize instead. "We love including family, no matter what." The phrase "no matter what" did something in the air. It wasn't hostile, not technically, but the women behind Vanessa exchanged a look, and one of the men, tall, blonde, insufferably relaxed, let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "You work with books, right?" one of the women asked. Her tone was the conversational equivalent of putting something under a magnifying glass. "Like old books?" "Book restoration," Evelyn said. Conservation. It's specialized work. There's a real demand for—" "So you work in a basement," Vanessa said. It landed the way it was intended to land. "My studio is in the basement of my house," Evelyn said carefully. "It's better for temperature and humidity control." "That's so interesting." Vanessa's smile didn't change. "I didn't know that was a career." "It is." Evelyn's hand tightened on her clutch. "It's a skilled trade. Some of the pieces I work on are centuries old." Vanessa tilted her head with the performance of someone considering something carefully. "Well, you always were very patient, sitting quietly, very studious." She said studious the way some people said unfortunate. "Do you remember Aunt Claire's birthday when we were kids? You spent the whole party reading in the corner." "I was 9, Evelyn said. "Some things don't change." Vanessa laughed, and the people behind her laughed with her, and the sound of it spread outward through the nearest cluster of partygoers the way a stone disturbs water. Evelyn felt her face go still. Not cold, but still. The way her hands went still when she was working on something fragile. It was a learned response, a defense mechanism dressed as composure. She had spent years perfecting it. "It was nice to see you," she said, which was a lie, and turned to leave. She didn't make it 2 steps. What happened next had the particular ugliness of something planned in advance but deployed to look spontaneous. Vanessa's voice rose. Not shouting, that would have been too obvious, but carrying, calibrated for the acoustics of a ballroom full of people whose attention she had spent years learning to direct. Everyone, do you know who this is? She gestured toward Evelyn with a champagne glass, a broad theatrical movement. This is my cousin Evelyn. She's the one I've been telling you all about. People turned. Not everyone, this wasn't a Hollywood movie where entire crowds pivot on command, but enough. Enough to feel like the room had rearranged itself around her. Evelyn stopped walking. She should have kept going. She knew that later, with the clarity of afterward, she would understand that the single best move had been to keep walking. But she stopped, and stopping was the error, because stopping meant she was still there when Vanessa continued. She lives with her grandfather in Wicker Park. She repairs old books for a living, which is lovely. It really is. Vanessa's voice was honeyed and cruel in exact proportion. We invited her tonight because, well, family is family, isn't it? Even the branches that don't quite flower. Laughter. A few polite noises of discomfort from people who weren't quite comfortable but weren't going to interrupt someone else's power play in someone else's house. The blonde man laughed openly. The women behind Vanessa arranged their expressions in the particular way of people who are enjoying something while maintaining plausible deniability. Vanessa? Evelyn's voice was quiet. Stop. I'm just introducing you, darling. You're so private. People don't even know you exist. A pause. I mean that kindly. She didn't mean it kindly. The family's best-kept secret, said one of the women behind her, and the laughter this time was less polite. Evelyn felt something happen in her chest that she had no precise word for. It wasn't rage, not exactly, because rage was hot, and this was cold, a cold spreading pressure like water rising in a sealed room. Her face stayed still. Her hands stayed still. But her eyes burned, and she was aware of them burning, and she was aware that people near her could see it, and she was aware that being seen, seeing it, was somehow the most humiliating thing of all. The family's biggest embarrassment, Vanessa said, and she said it clearly, and she said it into the open air of the ballroom like a verdict, is a 23-year-old woman who has never done anything worth mentioning. The silence that followed was very loud. Evelyn turned and walked out of the ballroom, and this time she didn't stop. Bratem. The terrace was accessible through a pair of glass doors at the far end of a hallway she found by instinct rather than intent. The body's desire to put walls between itself and the room where the damage had happened. It was cold outside, December cold, the kind of cold that had teeth, and she hadn't brought a coat because the invitation hadn't mentioned a terrace, and she hadn't planned on needing one. She stood at the railing with her clutch pressed against her stomach and looked out at the city. Chicago at night, from 32 floors up, was a kind of argument against smallness. All that light, all those distances, the dark shape of the lake to the east like a void that the city had decided to build alongside rather than away from. She could see headlights moving on Lakeshore Drive, small and ordered and persistent. She didn't cry. She had learned not to cry in the aftermath of public things, because crying in the aftermath felt like giving the public thing a secondary victory. She breathed instead, long, deliberate breaths that fogged in the cold air and disappeared. She had been here before. Not on this exact terrace, not with this exact wound, but in the general territory of the place where you go after someone reminds you of your smallness. She knew the geography. She was trying to remember why she had come tonight, what her grandfather had said, the exact words, the weight of them, when she heard the door open behind her. She didn't turn. She assumed it was a waiter or someone else escaping the party for a different reason, and she shifted slightly to the left along the railing to signal that this corner of the terrace was occupied, but that she wasn't interested in conversation. "You left before the toast," said a voice behind her. She turned then. "Bakush pas." The man standing near the door was not a waiter. She registered this in a sequence of impressions that arrived faster than she could process them individually. Dark coat, expensive and understated. Height. He was tall, taller than average, but it was a contained height, not imposing in the way of people who use their size as announcement. Dark hair. A face that was, in the particular light of a Chicago winter night 32 floors above the street, difficult to read, strong-boned, still, with the quality of something that had been under pressure for a very long time without showing it, He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't name. Not pity. She was familiar with pity and could identify it from across a room. Not contempt, not curiosity, not the polite disinterest of a stranger who'd accidentally intruded. Something more specific than any of those, a recognition, almost, though she was nearly certain she had never seen him before in her life. "I wasn't there for the toast," she said. It came out more even than she expected. "I know." He moved from the door toward the railing, not quickly, leaving a significant distance between them when he stopped. He looked out at the city for a moment before looking back at her. "You're Evelyn Ashcombe." The name in his mouth, her full name, which she hadn't given anyone tonight, stopped something in her. "I don't know you," she said. "No." He said it simply, without apology or elaboration. "You wouldn't." "Then how do you know my name?" He was quiet for a moment. The city noise from 32 floors down was constant and distant, like weather. "You repaired a book," he said finally, "about 8 months ago. A collection, 19th century, water damaged, belonged to someone who didn't know how to find the right person to fix it. They found you. You did the work in 6 weeks and sent it back with a note about the restoration process. Handwritten, 3 pages. Evelyn stared at him. She remembered the commission, a collection of Victorian-era natural history journals, significant water damage across the lower thirds of the pages, some mold blooming at the spine junction. The client had been a representative. She'd never met the actual owner, and the payment had been prompt and more than she'd expected and had kept the lights on for 2 months. She had written the note because she always wrote notes. It was something she'd started doing years ago, a way of explaining what she'd found and what she'd done and why, because she thought the people who cared about old books would want to know. Most clients appreciated it, a few found it excessive. She hadn't known the owner. "Those books belong to you," she said. "They belong to my mother," he said. "She's been dead for 9 years. Those journals were the last thing she owned that I hadn't lost track of." Something moved in Evelyn's chest that was not related to the cold. "I'm glad they could be restored," she said carefully. "You did more than restore them." He paused. "You restitched the binding on 4 volumes using period-appropriate thread. You matched the original red. My mother used to touch the spines when she read. She liked the way the thread felt under her fingers." Another pause, shorter. "The note explained that. I don't know how you knew." "I didn't," Evelyn said. "I just try to be accurate." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "My name is Cassian Moretti." She knew the name. Everyone in Chicago knew the name, the way everyone in certain cities knows the names of storms. Not because they've experienced them personally, but because the names were in the air, in the cautious pauses of certain conversations, in the particular way newspapers reported on organized crime figures without quite saying what they meant. Cassian Moretti was 34 and had been, by most accounts, running the Moretti organization since he was 27. The nature of that organization was the kind of thing that got discussed in terms of alleged, and reportedly and sources indicate, because the journalists who covered it had a strong preference for staying alive. She had never expected to be standing on a hotel terrace in the dark with him 6 feet to her left. "Okay," she said, because nothing else was immediately available. Something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face. It didn't complete itself. "You're not afraid." "I'm cold," she said. "Fear probably requires more bandwidth right now." This time the beginning of a smile went further, though it still didn't quite arrive. He reached into his coat, slowly, and she noticed the slowness was deliberate, an accommodation to the situation, and produced a folded garment. A jacket, dark wool, that he had apparently been carrying rather than wearing. "I don't," she started. "It's not an obligation," he said. "It's December." She considered this for a long moment, during which a gust of wind came off the lake and made the consideration considerably shorter. She took the jacket. It was heavier than it looked and warm from being carried against him, and she put it on without examining the label, though the fabric quality was obvious to the touch. "The things Vanessa said," Cassian said, looking out at the city again. "In there. You heard. People inside are still talking about it." Evelyn's jaw tightened. "It doesn't matter." "No," he said. "It doesn't." He said it as though matter were the wrong concept entirely. Not that it was unimportant, but that it operated on a scale that was simply irrelevant to the actual facts of the situation. She looked at him. In the cold amber wash of the city glow, he was harder to read than he'd been in the light from the door. There were marks on him, she thought. Not visible exactly, not scars she could see, but the cumulative impression of a man who had paid for his position in some currency that wasn't money. The stillness was not peace. It was something else, something practiced. "What are you doing on this terrace?" she asked. "The same thing you are. You came to the Holloway Gala to escape the Holloway Gala?" "I came because certain business requires presence." He looked at her sideways. "And then I saw you leave, and I remembered your name, and I thought—" He stopped, started again differently. "I've owed you something for 8 months. The price you charged for that restoration work was not enough. It was fair. For the work, maybe. Not for what it meant." Evelyn didn't have an answer for that. The wind moved between them, and she pulled the borrowed jacket tighter and thought about her grandfather at home with his tea and his detective novel, not knowing that she was standing on a terrace in the dark, talking to a man who ran organized crime in their city. "I should go back inside," she said, "or just go home." "Which one are you going to do?" She thought about it honestly. "Home," she said. "Definitely home." He nodded once, slowly, as though this was the correct answer. "I'll have a car brought around. I can take a cab. It's late." "I've taken cabs before." "I'm aware." Something shifted in his expression. Not impatience, not quite. "The offer is practical, not—" He seemed to choose a word with some care. "Not an imposition." She looked at him for a long moment. The man who had stood in the ballroom doorway while she was being mocked and had seen her walk out and had followed her out here, not with any visible agenda, but apparently just to return a jacket he'd been carrying and say her name correctly. "Thank you," she said, which meant both things at once. The jacket, the car, and something less specific than either of them that she didn't want to examine too closely right now. The car was black and unmarked and waiting at a side entrance she'd never have found on her own. The driver, a broad, quiet man, held the door without making it a performance. Cassian walked her there through a service corridor. "Shorter route," he said, which she suspected also meant away from anyone who might see her leaving with him. And they didn't speak much in the corridor. What they said was small and manageable, the language of two people who have had a significant interaction and are now allowing some space to develop around it. At the car, she removed his jacket and held it out to him. He took it. Their hands didn't quite touch, but almost. "Your grandfather," he said. "Arthur Ashcombe. He was turned down for a position at Heller and Cross about 3 years ago, supply chain oversight. He was qualified." Evelyn went still. "How do you know that?" "I know a lot of things." He didn't say it as a boast. It was more like a statement of geography. "I live in a place where information is terrain." There was a reason he didn't get the position. It wasn't about his qualifications. She stared at him. "What kind of reason?" He met her eyes directly. "The kind I can address." The word address in his mouth meant something entirely different than it would mean in anyone else's. She understood this without needing it explained. "Why would you—" she started. "Because you gave me back something I'd lost," he said, "and because I can." He said the second part without ornament, without pride, just as another statement of geography. "This is where I live. This is what grows here." The driver was waiting. The city moved around them. Taxis, distant sirens, a cold wind pulling at the edges of everything. "Mr. Moretti," she said, "come on, Cassian." She looked at him for a moment. "I don't know what to do with any of this." "You don't have to know tonight," he said. "Go home. Check on your grandfather. Sleep." Simple instructions. The kind that felt possible. She got into the car. The door closed with a sound like a well-built room. Through the window, she saw him standing at the edge of the light, his dark coat and the dark street behind him, watching the car pull away with an expression she couldn't quite read from this distance. Not satisfaction, not ownership. Something more patient than either of those. Something that looked, she thought, like someone who has just confirmed a long-held suspicion and is now quietly rearranging their plans. She arrived home at 11:20 to find her grandfather still awake. The detective novel replaced with the television, a cup of tea, cold, as usual, beside him on the armrest. He looked at her when she came through the door, and something in his expression shifted toward the careful kind of attention he reserved for moments when she was containing something. "How was it?" he asked. Evelyn put down her clutch, sat on the couch, looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Strange," she said. "It was strange." "Strange how?" "In ways I'm still working out." She looked at him. "How are you feeling tonight?" "My knee is being dramatic." He watched her with the patience of someone who knew how to wait. "Evie, what happened?" She told him some of it. Not all. Not Cassian's name, not the specific things that had been said about his employment history, because that would have required explanations she wasn't ready to give. She told him about Vanessa, about the ballroom, about what had been said. Her grandfather's face did something while she talked. Not anger, not exactly. He'd had 30 years of practice keeping specific emotions away from his expression in front of her, because he'd always understood that his distress at her distress made her distress worse. But there was something there, something that pressed against the surface and didn't quite break through. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Your dress was fine," he said. She almost laughed. The specificity of it. Not she was wrong or you're better than them or any of the expected constructions. "Just your dress was fine," said with total conviction. "I know," she said. "She's always been frightened of things she doesn't understand," Arthur said. "Quiet people make that type nervous. They don't know what you're thinking." "She doesn't care what I'm thinking." "That's the fear, Evie. If she didn't care, she wouldn't need the whole room to laugh." He picked up his tea, discovered it was cold, set it back down. "You going back?" "To the gala? It's over." "I mean that world. Events. People." He tilted his head slightly. The whole terrible project of being seen. She thought about a terrace in December, a borrowed jacket, a name she already knew before he gave it to her. "I don't know yet," she said. She didn't sleep well, not because of Vanessa. That wound was familiar enough in shape that she knew how to carry it, knew where it would be tender in the morning and where it would have scabbed over by the following week. She'd been small to Vanessa her entire life. That wasn't new. What kept her awake was the other thing. Cassian Moretti had walked out onto a terrace in December and given her his jacket and told her that he knew why her grandfather had been denied a job 3 years ago and had said the kind I can address in a voice like a closed door. She lay in the dark and thought about what that meant. Thought about who he was and what it meant that he knew her name and her grandfather's name and the specific details of a job rejection that had happened before she'd even known to be worried about it. She thought about the fact that she wasn't afraid of him. She should be. She understood on some rational and well-organized level that she should be. But on the terrace, in the cold, with the city spread out below them and her face still burning from what Vanessa had said, she had looked at Cassian Moretti and felt, not safety exactly, but something that occupied the same general space. Something that said, this is a man who sees what's actually in front of him. Most people didn't. Most people looked at Evelyn Ashcombe and saw quiet, plain, unremarkable, a background figure in someone else's story. The furniture of rooms. He had looked at her and said her name like it meant something specific. She fell asleep eventually, just before 3, to the sound of a wind picking up off the lake. She did not dream. She woke to 2 things in the same morning, separated by less than an hour. The first was a voicemail from a number she didn't recognize, left at 6:43 a.m., from a man who identified himself as a representative of Heller and Cross Supply Chain Management and said that they had reviewed an application from an Arthur Ashcombe and wished to schedule an interview at his earliest convenience, and that their interest was genuine and unconditional. His voice was the voice of someone reading from a script he'd been given that morning. The particular flat sincerity of someone doing a thing because a thing had been arranged. The second was the sound of a van outside. She looked out the front window and saw 2 men in coveralls examining the roof line of their house with the practiced confidence of people who had already been contracted and were simply confirming measurements. One of them had a clipboard. She stood at the window for a long moment, clutch bag from last night still on the table beside the door where she'd left it. The December morning making a gray rectangle of the view outside. The roof, which had been leaking for 2 winters. The job interview, which hadn't existed yesterday. "The kind I can address," he had said. She reached for her phone and realized she didn't have his number. He hadn't offered it. Of course he hadn't. Men like Cassian Moretti didn't hand out contact information on terraces to women they'd just met. That was not how that world worked. She understood this. She also understood, standing there in her quiet kitchen with the gray winter morning pressing against the window, that this was not a coincidence. She was not sure yet whether it was a gift or the beginning of something she didn't have a name for. She didn't know that in 11 days someone was going to try to take her. She didn't know that Cassian already knew it was coming. She stood at the window and watched the men on her roof, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like the furniture. The roofers were gone by noon. Evelyn stood in the front yard with her coffee going cold in her hands and watched the last truck pull away from the curb, and she counted the hours. Less than 12 since she'd stood on that terrace in December and listened to a man say the kind I can address. The work had been thorough. She'd gone up to check the attic crawlspace after they finished and found clean timber where there had been soft rot, new flashing around the chimney stack. The particular smell of fresh sealant, replacing the particular smell of slow water damage she'd been living with for so long she'd stopped noticing it. She hadn't called anyone, hadn't signed anything. The men in coveralls had shown her a work order when she'd come outside to ask, and the name on the account line was a property management company she'd never heard of, and the representative she'd asked to speak to had been unavailable, and the men had finished their work with polite efficiency and left without asking for a signature or payment. Her grandfather hadn't asked questions. He was in the kitchen when she came back in, standing at the stove scrambling eggs with the focused attention he brought to small domestic tasks, and he said, "Roof sounds quiet," and she said, "They were thorough," and that was the extent of it. But she watched him. She watched him pour his coffee and lower himself into his chair with the careful movement of a man whose knee announced itself every morning, and she thought about the voicemail, the flat, scripted voice of the Heller and Cross representative, genuine and unconditional. And she thought about what her grandfather's face would do when she told him. Whether it would be relief or suspicion, or the complicated mixture of both that a 71-year-old man who had been refused things for 30 years might reasonably feel when something was offered without apparent reason. She decided not to tell him yet. Not until she understood it better, herself. She was in her studio by 1 o'clock, which was where she went when she needed to think without appearing to think. The studio was small and ordered and smelled of paste and leather and the particular chemical note of her consolidants, and the work she had on the bench, a mid-century collection of botanical illustrations, cloth boards pulling from the text block, hinges cracked and brittle, was the kind of work that required her hands to be busy and her mind to be only partly engaged, leaving the rest of it free to run. She ran a bone folder along the edge of a lifted hinge and thought about Cassian Moretti. She thought about him methodically, the way she approached a damaged book, starting from the outside, working inward, cataloging what could be observed before making assumptions about what couldn't. He was 34. He ran an organization whose precise nature was described in the press with studied vagueness. Alleged criminal enterprises, reported ties to extortion and the city's underground financial networks, but whose actual weight in the city was not vague at all. People moved differently in conversations where his name appeared, not afraid exactly, or not only afraid, but careful in the way of people who understand that the geography has changed. He had followed her onto a terrace. He had known her name. He had known her grandfather's name and a specific professional injustice from 3 years ago and had spoken about addressing it in the same tone someone might use for, "I'll pick up milk on the way home." He had not touched her, had not threatened her, had not even flirted in any recognizable way. She pressed the hinge flat and held it. What he had done was see her. Specifically, accurately, without the overlay of assumption that most people brought to looking at Evelyn Ashcombe. And she was aware, had been aware since she woke up at 3 a.m. and lay in the dark thinking that this was the thing that had gotten under her defenses, not his power or his resources or the pragmatic magic of a repaired roof. Just that. Being seen by someone who was looking, which meant she was already in some amount of trouble. Her phone buzzed on the workbench. Unknown number. She picked it up. Ms. Ashcombe. A woman's voice, professional and warm in the calibrated way of someone whose job was professional warmth. "My name is Diana Reeve. I'm calling on behalf of a private client who is interested in commissioning a significant restoration project. a collection of early American legal manuscripts, some dated to the 1790s. The collection is considerable. My client is prepared to offer above standard rates and is specifically interested in your work based on a personal recommendation. Evelyn set down the bone folder. What personal recommendation? She asked. A slight pause. I'm not at liberty to say I'm afraid. The client values privacy. But the recommendation was specific and enthusiastic. Another pause, shorter. Would you be interested in discussing the project? She should have said, I'll need to consider it. She said, yes. She told herself it could be coincidence. She told herself this 3 times on the walk from her studio to the kitchen, where she made herself another coffee she didn't need, and she stopped telling herself after the 3rd time because she was not a person who wasted energy on things she didn't believe. The Heller and Cross voicemail. The roofers. Now a significant commission delivered through a private representative with a personal recommendation she wasn't allowed to trace. Cassian Moretti had said the kind I can address. He had said it, and then, in under 12 hours, he had demonstrated exactly what that meant across 3 separate dimensions of her life. She stood at the kitchen counter and felt something that was complicated enough that she had to take a moment to sort it out. It wasn't gratitude, or not purely. There was something else threaded through it, something that prickled, something with edges. Because what he was doing was generous, was arguably the most specific generosity anyone had ever directed at her, and it was also a demonstration of capacity, of reach, of the fact that there was apparently no corner of her quiet life that was beyond the range of his attention. She thought, what kind of man does this? She thought, and why? She thought about the journals. His mother's journals, restitched in period red thread, returned with a 3-page handwritten note. 9 years of losing things and then getting something back. She thought about what that kind of loss did to a person over time, the specific gravity of it. She was still thinking when her grandfather came into the kitchen and set his novel face down on the counter and looked at her with his careful eyes. Evie, he said, what aren't you telling me? She told him about Cassian. Not everything. Not the sense she had of standing at the edge of something larger than she could see the far side of. Not the complicated feeling that lived next to the gratitude. Not the fact that she'd spent the previous night awake picking apart the specific quality of the way he'd looked at her. She told him the facts, the name, the terrace, the jacket, the things that had been said. Arthur Ashcombe was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, Moretti. Yes. He picked up his novel and set it down again. The voicemail this morning. Yes. And the roof. Yes. He breathed through his nose. Outside, a truck went by on the street and the sound moved through the house and faded. You thanked him? I didn't have a way to contact him. No. His voice was carefully level. I suppose that's the point. She looked at him. What do you mean? People with that kind of reach don't give you a number to call. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a slow rotation, a thinking gesture she had known all her life. What they give you is the need to come back, to say thank you in person. He looked at her steadily. Did you feel that? The need? She held very still. Yes. Her grandfather nodded, not as though this confirmed something bad, but as though it confirmed something real. And you're asking yourself if it's manufactured. Yes. Is that what you think? That he made all of this happen so that you'd feel obligated? She thought about it honestly. She thought about the voice on the terrace, the way he'd said it's not an obligation about the jacket, the way he'd said, I've owed you something with the inflection of a man settling a debt rather than acquiring one. No, she said. I don't think it's manufactured. Neither do I. Arthur put down his coffee cup with the soft certainty of a man who has made a decision. But I think you should be careful about the difference between a man who sees you and a man who wants you to know he can see you. Evelyn didn't have an answer for that. The distinction felt important in a way she couldn't quite resolve. Well, she did not hear from Cassian directly for 6 days. In those 6 days, she completed an initial assessment for the manuscript commission. Diana Reeve had sent photographs, 31 high-resolution images of documents in varying states of deterioration, and the work was real, genuine, the kind of project that would take months and carry real professional weight. She accepted it. She told herself she accepted it because the work was legitimate and the payment was substantial, and those were both true. She did not hear from him directly, but she began to notice other things. There was a car, dark blue, that appeared on her street with a frequency that exceeded coincidence. Never parked directly in front of her house. Never the same spot twice. But within the same general radius, present in the mornings when she left for the coffee house where she did her administrative work, and present in the evenings when she returned, and gone on the days she didn't leave the house. There was a man at the coffee house, corner table, reading, never the same book twice, who was there on 4 of the 6 days, and who she noticed not because he drew attention to himself, but because he was exceptionally good at not drawing attention to himself. And she had spent enough time observing people from quiet edges of rooms to recognize the specific quality of deliberate invisibility. She was being watched over. She understood this with the same calibrated certainty she brought to damage assessment. This was not paranoia. Paranoia invented things. This was observation. She didn't confront the man at the coffee house. She didn't approach the car. She sat with what she knew and let it settle and tried to decide how she felt about it, which was harder than she'd expected because what she felt was not what she would have predicted herself to feel. She felt, against all reasonable expectation, something that resembled relief, which told her things about the texture of her life before this week that she hadn't wanted to examine too directly. Watson, Vanessa called on this 4th day. Evelyn saw the name on her screen and let it ring through twice before answering, a deliberate pause that she recognized as petty and permitted herself anyway. Evelyn? Vanessa's voice was different from the ballroom voice. Lower, private, stripped of performance. We should talk. Should we? A breath on the other end. I heard something about you and Cassian Moretti. Evelyn's grip on the phone tightened slightly. Where did you hear that? People talk. Vanessa's voice had an edge now, something pressing against the surface. I heard you left with him, after the gala. I heard he walked you to a car. I took a car home. I don't know what you heard. Don't. The word was sharp, clipped. Don't do the thing where you're vague and I'm supposed to feel stupid for asking. Did you leave with Cassian Moretti or not? He offered me a ride when it was late and I was alone, Evelyn said. That's the whole story. That's not a story. That's a sentence. A pause. How do you even know him? You repair books. He runs... Another pause, a different kind. He is not someone you stumble into, Evelyn. No one just stumbles into Cassian Moretti. I did some restoration work for a collection he owned. She kept her voice even. We'd never met in person. So this was a coincidence. Yes. And the things that have been happening, Vanessa stopped. What things? The silence on the other end was long enough to be its own kind of answer. When Vanessa spoke again, her voice had changed register, shifted into something that was partly anger and partly something Evelyn couldn't quite identify. People have been asking about me. Discreet questions. About my business connections. My social commitments. The kind of questions that don't come from journalists. A pause that hummed with tension. The kind that come from lawyers. Or worse. Evelyn said nothing. Evelyn. Vanessa's voice was careful now. The careful of someone who is frightened and trying not to show it. If you said something to him, about me, about what happened at the gala, I didn't, Evelyn said. Then why is someone... I don't know, Vanessa. She kept her voice flat and clean. I genuinely don't know. Which was true in the precise sense. She didn't know what specifically Cassian had set in motion or why the questions were being asked now. She had only the shape of it, the inference. If someone's asking questions about you, maybe you should think about whether you've given them something to find. The silence that followed was the silence of someone who had just been handed an answer they didn't want. Vanessa hung up without saying goodbye. On the 6th day, Evelyn's studio phone rang, the landline, the number listed in the professional directories, not her cell, and she answered, expecting a client inquiry, and found instead a voice she recognized. I should have left a way to reach me, Cassian said. No preamble. That was an oversight. Her heart did something she noted and set aside. It was. Are you at your studio? Yes. I'd like to come by, if that's acceptable. She looked at the manuscript photographs pinned above her workbench, the commission that had arrived through a representative who wasn't allowed to name him. The Reeve Commission, she said. That's yours. Yes. You should have said so. I should have, he agreed, with the plain simplicity of a man who is capable of acknowledging error without making a production of it. Can I come by? She thought about what her grandfather had said. The difference between a man who sees you and a man who wants you to know he can see you. She thought about the car on her street, the man at the coffee shop, the 6 days of indirect presence that had been both protective and a demonstration. She thought about Vanessa's voice. Frightened under the anger, questions being asked. Yes, she said. Come by. He arrived in 40 minutes, alone. No driver, no visible accompaniment, though she understood by now that alone was a relative term for someone like him. He came to the side entrance of the house, the studio entrance, which she hadn't told him about, which meant he'd known it, which meant he had some degree of architectural familiarity with her house that she hadn't granted him. She had decided not to address that, not yet. He came in and stood in the doorway of the studio with his coat on and looked at the space the way people look at rooms that surprise them, not with performance, but with actual attention. The humidity monitors, the specialized lights, the workbench with its neat row of tools, the manuscripts in their archival sleeves, the bone folder she'd set down when she heard the knock. This is serious work, he said. It always has been, she said. He looked at her. In the specific quality of her studio light, she could see him more clearly than she had on the terrace. The lines of his face, the something under pressure quality she'd registered before, more visible now in a space that was intimate and ordered and quiet. I owe you an explanation. Several, she said, but one will do to start. He came in and she gestured to the stool she kept for clients who came to consult, and he sat, which surprised her slightly. She hadn't expected someone like him to take the lesser seat without consideration. He sat, and he put his hands on his knees, and he looked at her directly. 8 months ago, he said, I was moving through a neighborhood I had no public business being in. There was a situation that got complicated. He said complicated with the economy of someone who was not going to specify what complicated had consisted of. I was injured, not critically, but significantly, and I was alone, which I am not supposed to be, and I needed somewhere to stop. She remembered. 8 months ago, a November night, the storm that had come off the lake with the sudden savagery of November storms. She had been leaving her studio through the side entrance, late, past 10, she'd been working against a deadline, and she had found him on the step, sitting against the doorframe, one arm held at a specific angle that she had recognized as the angle of pain management, jacket dark with rain and with something else. She hadn't known who he was. She'd brought him inside. She'd had first aid supplies. She kept them because restoration chemicals sometimes required it. And she'd dealt with the wound, which was a deep laceration along his left side, and she had not asked questions and she had not called anyone. And after 40 minutes, he had stood up and said thank you and left. She had assumed he was a man who'd been mugged. She had not followed up. She had, in the weeks afterward, checked the crime reports the way you check on something you're not sure about, and found nothing specific enough to connect to. She hadn't known his name until the gala. I know what night you mean, she said. You didn't ask what had happened. It wasn't my business. Most people would have asked. Most people aren't me, she said, and didn't mean it as arrogance, just as fact. He looked at her steadily. You didn't call anyone. You'd have left if I had, and you were losing blood. She held his gaze. It seemed like a bad combination. Something moved in his expression. Not the beginning of a smile this time, something quieter and further down. The journals, he said. I had them sent to you because I knew your name by then. I'd found out who you were, and I wanted to... He stopped. I wanted to do something that was appropriate to what you'd done. The journals were the right scale. And the job? The roof? The commission? The commission is real work. The payment is real. He said this evenly. The other two are corrections to things that should not have happened. The roof leaking was not something that should not have happened. That was just maintenance I couldn't afford. The denial of your grandfather's application was engineered, he said, by a man with a financial interest in the company that got the contract instead. I didn't cause it, but I was aware of it afterward, And I didn't address it when I could have. That's a debt. She stared at him. You knew about that? Not when it happened. After. His voice was level. Information comes to me that I don't always act on. I should have acted on that one. The studio was very quiet. The humidity monitors made their small sound. Outside, the December street was its usual gray self. That's a lot of responsibility to take on for a stranger, she said. You weren't a stranger after that November. She absorbed this, turned it over, looked at the places where it might be something other than what it sounded like and found them. Found the questions, found the things that weren't yet resolved. Vanessa called me, she said. She's frightened. She says someone is asking questions about her. Cassian's expression didn't change. Cassian. Yes. Are you going to tell me that's not connected? A pause. Short and specific. No, he said. She breathed through it. You can't. What she did was in front of 200 people. His voice was still level, but the level was different now. Lower, flatter. The level of something said from a place where decisions had already been made. She used a public space to diminish someone He stopped, his jaw set slightly. It doesn't go unaddressed. It happened to me, Evelyn said. Not to you. Yes. His eyes met hers. That's why it goes unaddressed only to a point. I'm not going to burn her down. But she should understand the weight of the thing she did. And the people asking questions, are asking questions, he said. That's all. For now. For now. 2 words that carried a very full cargo. She looked at him for a long moment, and he let her look, which was not a small thing. Most people, she had noticed, became uncomfortable under sustained direct observation and moved to fill the space with words or motion. He didn't. He sat on the client's stool with his hands on his knees and let her see whatever she was going to see. You're going to keep having me watched, she said. Not a question. Yes. I haven't agreed to that. No. He held her gaze. But someone has been watching your house for 3 months who isn't mine. I found out about it 2 weeks before the gala. That's partly why He stopped again. Recalibrated. I need you to understand that my people watching your street is not surveillance. It's a counter to something that was already there. The air in the studio changed. Who? She said. I don't know yet. He said it flatly, which meant he was working on it. But the timing suggests it's connected to people who have a reason to want leverage against me. The word leverage landed in the room with its full weight. Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, or not only. Something more complicated. The thing you feel when you realize that the situation you walked into was larger than the door suggested. That what started as a professional connection and an unexpected kindness and a borrowed jacket on a cold terrace now had an entirely different topology. That she was standing on terrain she hadn't known existed, with implications she hadn't consented to, because someone had been watching her house for 3 months before she ever knew Cassian Moretti's name. She said, 3 months. Yes. Before the gala. Yes. She set down the bone folder she hadn't realized she'd picked up. The small sound of it against the workbench was very loud in the studio. So when Vanessa invited me, I don't know if that's connected, Cassian said. I don't have that answer yet. She heard the yet and understood that it was not a hedge. It was a timeline. He would have the answer, and he was telling her it wasn't yet. And the precision of that distinction said something about how he moved through the world that she was still learning to read. Could she have known? Evelyn asked. Vanessa, could she have known that someone was watching me before the gala and invited me anyway, and used the public humiliation to signal something? He said it evenly, turning the idea the way she'd turn a damaged page, carefully, against the light, looking for what was underneath. It's possible. I don't have confirmation. But you think it's possible? He met her eyes. I think your cousin is not as stupid as she has incentive to appear. The studio felt smaller than it had 20 minutes ago. Not in a physical sense. Same walls, same bench, same ordered quiet. But in the sense that the space it occupied in the larger map had been redrawn around it, and the new map was considerably less benign. So what do we do? She asked. He looked at her for a moment. We had landed in the space between them, and he had heard it, and she could see him hearing it. "We don't do anything yet," he said. "You continue your work. You let my people be where they are. And you tell me if anything changes, if someone approaches you, if you're followed, if something feels wrong. I don't have your number." He reached into his coat and produced a card. Plain, cream, a single number printed in small type. No name. He set it on the edge of her workbench. She looked at it. "And if I call and nothing is wrong?" "Then nothing is wrong," he said simply. She picked up the card, looked at it, then at him. "You're very certain I'll call?" "I'm certain that if something happens and you don't call, I'll spend a significant amount of time being angry at myself for not making it easier for you to reach me." He stood from the stool and buttoned his coat. "So yes, I'm certain." He left through the side entrance, the same way he'd come in, and the studio settled back into its own quiet, and Evelyn stood at her workbench for a long time after the door closed, looking at the plain cream card in her hand. She thought about 3 months. She thought about who watches a woman who repairs old books in a basement studio in Wicker Park, and why, and for what eventual purpose. She didn't sleep at all that night. Well, the answer to the question of Vanessa came 9 days later, and it arrived not through Cassian's network, but through Evelyn's own eyes. She had been taking a different route to the coffee house, partly habit variation, partly because Cassian had mentioned once that predictability was its own kind of vulnerability, and the idea had settled into her behavior without her consciously deciding to let it. She was 2 blocks from home on a Tuesday morning, collar turned up against a December wind that had opinions, when she saw Vanessa's car. She knew the car. Cream-colored, European, the kind of car that announced its cost through restraint rather than ostentation. It was parked on a side street she didn't normally use, and it was running, exhaust faint in the cold air, which meant Vanessa was either in it or had been in it recently. Evelyn stopped. She should have kept walking. She understood this, the way she'd understood it at the gala when Vanessa called her name to Carrie. But she stopped, and she looked, and she saw Vanessa sitting in the driver's seat, and she saw, through the window, the profile of the man in the passenger seat. She didn't know his face, but she knew his type. The particular quality of stillness, the way he sat in the car seat like a man who had calculated all the exits before getting in. The kind of man you learn to identify not by appearance, but by posture, by the quality of attention they directed at their surroundings. She had been living with Cassian's people in her peripheral vision for nearly 2 weeks. She knew what that kind of stillness looked like. She walked past the car without changing her pace. She did not look directly. She noted the plate number in the specific way she noted details when restoring documents, not by trying to remember, but by letting the information settle into her hands, into her muscle memory, which was more reliable than conscious effort. At the corner, she turned and took out her phone and typed the plate number into a message to the plain cream card's number and sent it before she'd fully decided to. His response came in under 4 minutes. "Where?" She typed the street. "Don't go back that way. Continue to the coffee house. My people are already there." She put her phone in her pocket and kept walking and tried to make her breath come evenly, which was harder than she expected because she had spent years being afraid of invisible things, of failure, of inadequacy, of the slow erosion of options, but she was not experienced at being afraid of specific things with license plates and running engines. Cassian came to the coffee house himself. This surprised her. She had expected the quiet man from the corner table, or someone like him, a representative, a messenger. But it was Cassian who came through the door 40 minutes after her text, without apparent urgency, ordering a coffee at the counter with the ease of a man who had never been in a hurry in his life, and then carrying it to the corner table and sitting down across from her. "You're good at not looking alarmed," she said. "Practice," he said. He set down his coffee and looked at her. You looked directly at the man in the passenger seat. For less than a second. Less than a second is enough if he was paying attention. Was he? I don't know yet. He said the yet the same way he always said it. The plate is registered to a shell company, third layer out from a holding group with ties to the Dravek organization. The name meant nothing to her. She said so. Victor Dravek runs the second largest criminal operation in Chicago, Cassian said, without inflection. He has been attempting to expand into territory that overlaps with mine for approximately 2 years. He has not been successful. She absorbed this. And Vanessa has apparently been in contact with his people for approximately 6 weeks. 6 weeks. The gala had been just over 2 weeks ago. So before the gala, she said, yes. And she invited me to the gala. Yes. She looked at him across the small table. The coffee house was moderately full around them, the noise of other people's conversations creating a kind of privacy. Tell me what you think happened. He was quiet for a moment, not hedging, thinking. She had learned to distinguish the two. Vanessa has financial exposure, he said finally. Several bad investments over the past 18 months. She owes money to people who are not patient. Dravik's people approached her with an arrangement, information about my known associations, my peripheral contacts, in exchange for relief of the debt. He paused. She told them about the book restoration commission, the private one from 8 months ago. They identified you as a contact point, not a significant one, not yet, and began surveillance as a precaution. And then she invited me to the gala and publicly humiliated you in front of 200 people. He said it flatly, which either served Dravik's purposes in a way I haven't fully mapped yet, or was entirely personal, and the timing was coincidence. You don't believe in coincidence. Not when the same name appears in 2 different parts of a problem, he said. Evelyn wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. Outside the window, December moved along the street with its gray indifference. She thought about Vanessa's voice on the phone, the fear under the anger, real and specific. She thought about a woman who had been cruel to her entire life, the casual architecture of that cruelty, and whether that architecture had always been purely personal or whether it had, at some point, become instrumental. She knew, Evelyn said. It wasn't a question. I think she knew they were watching you before the gala, Cassian said. I don't think she fully understood why. I think she understood that you had become adjacent to me through the commission, and I think she used the gala to test something. To test what? He met her eyes. Whether I would react. The coffeehouse sounds continued around them, the espresso machine, the low music, someone laughing at a table near the window. She was watching to see if you'd respond to what she did to me, Evelyn said slowly. Yes. And you did. Yes. His voice was entirely even, which told her and told Dravik's people something they wanted to know. That you care what happens to me. He didn't look away. Yes, she sat with this. Let it settle into the full shape of what it meant. She was not the target. She had understood that already, in the abstract. She was the adjacent thing, the thing that had been identified because of its proximity, its potential use as a handle on something larger. She thought about that word. Handle. She had been a handle her entire life in a different sense, the functional, invisible part that other people use to get to places. The quiet cousin, the reliable granddaughter, the girl who did the work that nobody noticed until it was done and valuable. She was tired of being a handle. What do we do? She asked. I increase your security, he said. I accelerate the mapping of Dravik's network, and I ask you to... He stopped. Something moved across his face that was more visible than his usual careful containment. I ask you to stay inside the parameters I give you. Routes, timing, locations. I know that's not... I understand why, she said. That doesn't mean it's not an imposition. No, she agreed. It is an imposition, but you're not asking me to do it for your convenience. She looked at him. So, yes. He breathed in slightly. A small motion, barely visible, but she was watching closely enough by now to see it. There's something else, he said. She waited. The man in the car with Vanessa this morning. He set down his coffee. I know who he is. He's not Dravik's. He's Dravik's intermediary with someone else, a third party that I haven't fully identified, which means this isn't a bilateral situation. It's triangular, she said, at minimum. She breathed through this. The picture she'd had, complicated enough already, Vanessa's debt and Dravik's ambition and an unwanted surveillance she'd been living inside without knowing it, had just grown a new dimension. Is my grandfather safe? She asked. Yes. Immediate. Unambiguous. He is the highest current priority on my list. She felt something release in her chest that had been clenched since the morning, since the car on the side street with its running engine and the profile of a man she didn't know in the passenger seat. "Okay," she said. They sat in silence for a moment. The particular silence of two people who have just laid out a serious situation and are each separately carrying the weight of it. "I'm going to ask you something," Evelyn said. "Yes." "When you came to the gala, before you found me on the terrace, before any of that, did you already know I'd be there?" He held her gaze. "Yes." "Because of the surveillance. You'd been tracking who was watching me, and you knew Vanessa had invited me." "Yes." She nodded slowly. "And you came because—" "Because I wanted to see if you were all right," he said. "And because I had been trying to find an appropriate way to introduce myself for 2 months and failing, and the gala was a context where my presence wasn't remarkable." A pause. "Those are both true simultaneously." She looked at him. "You're not a simple man." "No," he agreed. "I'm not a simple woman." Something in his expression shifted. Not the beginning of a smile, something more serious than that. "I know," he said. "That's the whole problem." Yeah. 3 days after the coffee house, the attempt happened. It was a Tuesday evening, just past 6, and Evelyn was leaving her studio through the side entrance. The same entrance she'd found Cassian on 8 months ago, the same narrow strip of concrete between the house and the neighbor's fence, poorly lit, a shadow corridor that she had navigated 1,000 times without thinking. She was thinking about the Reeve manuscripts. She had been consolidating a particularly fragile page all afternoon, a 1792 court document with foxing across 40% of its surface, and she was still half inside the problem, the specific weight of the decision she'd made about solvent concentration, whether she'd gotten it right, whether she'd know by morning. Her bag was on her shoulder, her phone was in her coat pocket. She heard them before she saw them, not loud. No shout, no warning sound. Just the specific quality of movement that doesn't belong to a space, the rhythm of two people moving in coordination who have been waiting in the kind of stillness that is different from natural stillness. And her body registered this before her mind did, the way a hand pulls back from heat before the thought hot arrives. She turned. 2 men, both large. Both moving with the unhurried confidence of people who have done this before and know that unhurried confidence is itself a tool. It says there is no scenario in which this ends differently, so don't exhaust yourself. She opened her mouth. She did not scream. What came out was not quite a scream. It was a sharper thing, involuntary, a sound she had never made before in her life. And then the alley filled with other people. She didn't understand it immediately. There was movement from both ends of the narrow corridor, fast and organized, and voices. Not to her, past her, the specific clipped language of a situation already in progress, already accounted for, already being resolved. She was grabbed, not by one of the 2 men, who were being addressed by Cassian's people with a speed that turned their unhurried confidence into something else entirely, but pulled sideways, gently, firmly, by a woman she half recognized from 2 days outside the coffee house, who put a hand on Evelyn's back and said, "With me. Now. Move. Bach tichis mamashsaim." She moved. The alley behind her became noise, impact, motion, someone's voice raised and cut short. She did not look back. The woman moved her through the side gate and into the neighboring yard and through another gate and into a car that was running on the parallel street, and the door closed and the car moved. Evelyn realized she was shaking, not visibly. Her hands were still in her lap, her bag was still on her shoulder, she was still technically composed in all the visible ways. But something internal was vibrating at a frequency that she had no voluntary control over, and she recognized this as the body's accounting, the biological audit that happens after the threat is past, and the system processes what it just nearly survived. "Where are we going?" she said. Her voice was almost level. "Mr. Moretti's location," the woman said from the front seat. "He's been notified." Evelyn looked out the window. The street was ordinary. December, dark, other people's lives proceeding at their usual pace. "Were those Dravek's men?" she asked. "We believe so," the woman said. "We'll know more shortly." She looked at her hands. They were not shaking. Steady. Book restorer's hands trained for stillness. The trembling was somewhere deeper than hands. home. Cassian was waiting at a building she hadn't been to before. Not his home, she thought, or not his primary one. It had the quality of a secondary location, a professional space, clean and sparse, and set up for the work of managing information rather than living in. There were people there, 3 of them, all doing things on screens and phones with the focused brevity of people in the middle of something. He crossed the room when she came through the door. He did not touch her. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at her face with an expression that was very carefully controlled, and in which she could see, beneath the control, something that was not calm at all. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No." She held his gaze. "Your people were already there." "Yes." His jaw was set. The something beneath his control pressed at the surface. "They anticipated the route." "How?" "Because I was wrong about the timeline." His voice was even, and the evenness cost him something. "I thought we had more time before they moved. I was wrong." Evelyn absorbed this. He had been wrong. He was telling her so directly, without hedging, without repositioning it as something other than error. She noted this and filed it. "Vanessa," she said. He looked at her. "She knew the route," Evelyn said. "She knows where I live. She knows I use the side entrance in the evenings. She's been to the house before, years ago." She kept her voice very flat and very clean because the alternative was something she wasn't ready to let into the room. She told them. Cassian said nothing, which was its own answer. "My cousin," Evelyn said, "told people where to find me in an alley in the dark." "Evelyn, I'm not asking you to confirm it." She turned away from him, toward the window, and looked at the city outside. The Chicago skyline was the same as it had been from the terrace at the gala. All that light, all those distances. And she had stood at a railing 2 weeks ago and thought about why she had come to the gala and whether the attempt itself was enough. She had a different answer now. The trembling was still there, somewhere under the steadiness. But something else was there now, too. Something that had been quiet her entire life and had watched from corners and had spent 23 years accepting the particular gravity of being small and overlooked and not worth the effort of malice. Malice, it turned out, had found her anyway. She turned back from the window. Cassian was watching her with the expression of a man who has sent people into a situation that cannot be undone and is living in the specific aftermath of that. "What happens now?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I dismantle Dravek's operation with the evidence I've been building for 2 years, and I do it faster than I was planning because the timeline has changed." He paused. "And I find the third party, the one the intermediary was connected to. Because Dravek doesn't have a strong enough reason to move this quickly unless someone else is pushing. Someone who wants leverage against you. Someone who is willing to use you as the mechanism," he said, and his voice on the last word was its own kind of weather. She looked at him. This man she had found bleeding on her side step in a November storm, whom she had treated with her basic first aid supplies without asking questions, whose mother's journals she had stitched back together with period red thread because accuracy was what she offered. This man who had been carrying her name in some internal record for 8 months, who had repaired things in her life without being asked, without announcing it, with the particular competence of someone who was accustomed to moving the world and had simply turned that competence toward her, who had been wrong about a timeline and was standing in front of her telling her so. "Someone is using me," she said, "to get to you." "Yes." "Which means," she said slowly, "that my safety and your safety are now the same problem." He held her gaze. "Yes." She breathed once, steady. The trembling was almost gone. What had replaced it was something she didn't have a precise name for. Not rage, not resolve, not fear, but an amalgam of all 3 that had been alloyed by the specific heat of standing in an alley and hearing people move in the darkness, who meant to take her somewhere she would not have chosen. "Then we solve it together," she said. "Tell me what you need me to know." He looked at her for a moment. The same quality of looking she'd felt on the terrace, the seeing what's actually there quality, specific and accurate. And then he pulled a chair from the nearest table and set it in front of her and sat down across from her, and he began to talk. He talked for 2 hours. Evelyn sat across from him at the spare table in that spare room and listened the way she listened to clients describing damage, not just to the surface facts, but to the structure underneath, the load-bearing elements, the places where the deterioration had gone deeper than the visible evidence suggested. She asked questions when she needed clarification and stayed quiet when she didn't. And by the end of the 2 hours, she understood the shape of something that had been building for considerably longer than 2 weeks. Viktor Dravik had been trying to acquire Cassian's territory for 2 years, not through violence, or not primarily, through pressure, through the slow, patient work of identifying Cassian's associations and finding the ones that could be leveraged, the ones that had vulnerabilities, the ones that could be turned from neutral to hostile with the right application of money or fear or both. Vanessa had been one of those associations, identified through the commission, through the surveillance, through 6 weeks of careful development by people who were very good at finding financial desperation and making it productive. The third party, the one connected to the intermediary in Vanessa's car, was a man named Garrett Souls. Evelyn did not know this name either, and this time Cassian's explanation was more cautious, more compressed. Souls was not criminal, or not in the way Dravik was criminal. He was political. He had interests in the restructuring of the city's underground financial networks that were connected to legitimate investment positions that would only pay out if those networks were reorganized in a specific way. He didn't want Cassian dead. He wanted Cassian destabilized, distracted, reactive, pulled away from the long-game moves he'd been making for 2 years towards something more immediate and more expensive. Using Evelyn as bait was not the endgame. It was the opening move of something larger. "How long have you known about Solis?" she asked. 5 weeks, he said. "And Dravik?" 2 years. She looked at him. "You've been building a case." "I've been building several cases," he said, "which is why moving the timeline is a problem. I'm not finished." "What does finished look like?" He was quiet for a moment. "It looks like Dravik's network without its structural supports, which I can do. I have the evidence." He paused. "But Souls is more complicated. Because Souls has legitimate cover and legitimate connections, and moving against him requires a different kind of precision." "And now they've moved against me," she said, "which means you have to move faster than you wanted." "Yes." She looked at the table between them. "What happens if you move before you're ready?" He met her eyes. "Things break that don't need to." She understood this. She understood it with the specific comprehension of someone who had spent years doing work that required patience, who knew that the difference between a restoration done right and a restoration done fast was sometimes the difference between a book that survived and a book that didn't, and that the pressure to go faster was always there and was always the enemy of the work. "Tell me what you need," she said again. "Specifically," he told her. What he needed was not what she expected. He did not need her to disappear, to go somewhere safe and quiet and wait for him to solve the problem around her. He had people for containment. He demonstrated that in the alley. What he needed from her was something different. The Reeve Commission documents. She stared at him. "The 1792 legal manuscripts," he said. "Specifically the property transfer records from the 3rd volume. I need you to tell me what you found in them." "You have them to restore," she said slowly. "Not to read." "I had them sent to you to restore," he said. "And because I needed them read by someone who wouldn't understand what they were looking at." The temperature in the room changed. She felt it change. Not dramatically, not with any theatrical shift of light or sound, but the way temperature changes in a room when a window is opened in winter. A quiet, pervasive drop that touched everything. "That's why Diana Reeve called me," she said. Her voice was very even. "Not because of a personal recommendation." "The personal recommendation was real," he said. "The commission was structured the way it was structured because I needed the documents examined by a professional with no connection to either Dravik or Solis in a secure private environment without triggering the kind of attention that would come from running them through any of my own people." She let the silence sit. "You used my studio," she said. "Yes." "As a secure location you didn't have to declare." "Yes." He held her gaze. "I'm telling you now because you asked for everything. And that's everything." She breathed in once, let it out, looked at the wall to the left of his face because looking directly at him right now required more equanimity than she had immediate access to. He had moved things in her life. The roof, the job, the commission. She had looked at all of those and asked the hard question, gift or mechanism, and she had decided, based on what she'd seen of him, that the answer was gift. That the transparency about the surveillance, the directness about the alley, The way he'd said I was wrong about the timeline without deflection. All of it pointed to a man who was capable of honesty even when honesty cost him. And it was still true. He was still that man. And he had also sent her the commission because he needed her studio and her professional cover, and the clean, untraceable environment of a private book restorer in Wicker Park. Both things were true at the same time. "What's in the property transfer records?" she asked. He told her. The documents she'd been restoring, carefully, painstakingly, with the humidity monitors and the specialized lights, and the solvent she'd spent a day calculating the right concentration for, were the original property transfer records for a set of downtown Chicago parcels dating to 1792. The parcels had been built over, sold, rezoned, and redeveloped so many times in 2 centuries that their original ownership boundaries had become legally obscure. Soules had spent 4 years acquiring adjacent properties based on a title interpretation that his lawyers had constructed from later records. If the 1792 originals showed a different boundary, which Cassian believed they did, based on a surveyor's reference in a document he'd found separately, then Soules's entire property position was legally compromised. Not criminal, but deeply, expensively, publicly compromised. The kind of compromise that dismantled a man's leverage over a city. "You need me to finish the restoration," she said, "and document what you find. In a way that will hold up. In a way that a legitimate historical conservator would document it," he said. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, Chicago continued its winter operations. Sirens, wind, the endless small noise of a city at night. Her grandfather was at home with his tea and his television, and the quiet men Cassian had placed 2 houses down, who weren't quite as invisible as they thought they were to a woman who had spent her life learning to see things at the edges. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he said, "I should have. From the beginning. Before I accepted the commission." "Yes." She waited for the qualification. The explanation of why he hadn't. The architecture of reasoning that would make the withholding sensible. It didn't come. He just held her gaze with the specific stillness of a man accepting the weight of an accurate judgment. "I'll finish the documents," she said, "but I want full information from this point forward. Everything you know that touches my life. Everything." "Yes," he said, and then, after a pause, "I'm sorry for the way this was constructed." She believed him. That was the complicated thing. She looked at him in that spare room with the city outside and the crisis building around them both, and she believed that he was sorry. And she understood that being sorry and having done it anyway were not mutually exclusive in a man who operated the way he operated, who had spent years treating the world as a set of problems to be managed rather than people to be trusted. That was a thing he was going to have to change. Whether he could was a question that belonged to a different part of the story. The part that came after the current emergency was resolved. "Get me back to my studio," she said. "I have work to do." She finished the 3rd volume restoration in 31 hours. She didn't sleep. She had 4 coffees and 2 sandwiches delivered by one of Cassian's people, who left them outside the studio door without knocking, and she worked through the night and through the following day with the focused narrowness of someone doing the most important work of their career under conditions that made concentration an act of will. The foxing on the property transfer documents was extensive, but the underlying text was intact. The 1792 ink had been iron gall, which lasted, which was why people had used it for things that mattered. She stabilized the pages, documented the condition before and after with her standard photographic protocol, and then she read what they said. Cassian was right about the boundary. The original 1792 survey placed the eastern parcel line 14 feet further west than Soules's title interpretation claimed. 14 feet. In 1792, in undeveloped land, 14 feet was nothing. In current downtown Chicago, across multiple city blocks, 14 feet per parcel across 9 parcels added up to a discrepancy that had a dollar value in the 9 figures and a legal implication that made Soules's entire position not just contestable, but indefensible. She documented everything. 3-page written assessment, her standard format, the format she always used, the same format she'd used for Cassian's mother's journals. Photographs at every stage, chain of custody notes, professional certification. She photographed the documents themselves, page by page, with her highest resolution equipment. Then she called the plain cream card number. "It's done," she said. "Come and get it." But he came in an hour, and this time he brought two other people. A woman with a legal background who asked Evelyn precise questions about the documentation protocol and took notes, and a quiet man who photographed her photographs and the original documents with his own equipment and left without speaking. Cassian stood to the side and let them work, and watched Evelyn with an expression she had learned enough to read by now. Not ownership, not satisfaction, something more careful, something that lived in the vicinity of gratitude but was too complicated to be only that. When they were done, the woman with the legal background shook Evelyn's hand and said, "This is excellent work," in the voice of someone who means it technically. After they left, Cassian stood in the studio. "Tonight," he said. Evelyn looked up from where she was returning the original documents to their archival sleeves. "Tonight what?" "Souls has organized a presentation, a private one, at the Palmer Club downtown. He's been planning it for 3 weeks. A proposal to a group of investors and political figures about the downtown development project, the one that depends on his title interpretation." He paused. "I'm going to attend." She stared at him. "You're going to walk into a room full of Souls' people. And Dravek's," he said. "They have overlapping interests in the development. Several of Dravek's financial people will be there." "That's, she started. "Efficient," he said. "I was going to say something else." "I know." He looked at her. "This is how it ends. Not through attrition, through a single point of pressure applied at the moment of maximum exposure." He said it without drama, the way she'd say, "This is the appropriate solvent for this particular paper stock." The logic of the work. "I need this to be done before they recalibrate their approach to you." She felt the cold expand in her chest again. "They'll try again. Not if there's nothing left to try with." He picked up his coat from where he'd set it on the corner of her workbench. "I need you to stay here tonight. My people are at both entrances. Your grandfather has 3 people on his street." "Cassian," he looked at her. "What happens in that room?" He was quiet for a moment. "The evidence goes where it needs to go. The documentation you produce becomes part of a legal filing that's already prepared and waiting. Souls' investors see the boundary discrepancy in real time, on documents they can't dispute, and the project they came to hear about ceases to exist as a viable proposition." He paused. "Dravek's people see that their financial position in the development is now untenable, and they understand what that means for the broader arrangement with Souls. Bishat Sikipais." "And Vanessa," she said, his jaw set. "Vanessa will be addressed through the appropriate channels. Her involvement in the kidnapping attempt is documented. There are people who handle that." "Legal people?" "Legal people," he confirmed. She looked at him. "Will you be safe? In that room?" Something moved in his face. The question had reached somewhere past the careful surface, and he hadn't fully prepared for it. "Yes," he said. "That's not a detailed answer." "No." He met her eyes. "But it's the honest one. I'll have people there. The room will have been prepared. I've done this kind of work before. In a room with Dravek's people and Souls' people simultaneously." "Not simultaneously." A pause. "Not exactly like this." She set down the archival sleeve she was holding. "Come back," she said. It came out more direct than she'd planned. No softening, no frame around it. Just the statement. He looked at her for a long moment with the quality of looking that she had been cataloging since the terrace, since the borrowed jacket, since the November night 8 months ago when he'd sat on her side step losing blood into the rain. "Yes," he said. He left. She did not stay in the studio. She told herself she was going to. She sat at her workbench for 20 minutes after he left with her hands flat on the surface and the humidity monitors making their small sound. And she told herself she was going to sit here and let his people be where they were and let the night resolve itself without her involvement. Then she thought about 14 feet, about 9 parcels, about the documentation she'd spent 31 sleepless hours producing, which was now moving through the city toward a room she'd never seen, carrying the weight of everything that had been built toward this night. She thought about a man who had sat on her side step in a November storm and let her treat a wound without explaining what had made it, who had spent 8 months carrying her name in some internal record, who had said I was wrong about the timeline and I'm sorry for the way this was constructed with the plain, painful directness of someone who was learning in real time to operate differently. She thought about Vanessa's voice on the phone. Frightened. The specific fear of a woman who had made a bad calculation and was living in the consequences of it. She thought about her grandfather at home, 3 people on his street, his tea going cold, his detective novel open across his knee. She put on her coat. She told the woman at the side entrance that she was going to check on her grandfather and that she would need someone to come with her. The woman, the same one who had pulled her through the side gate the night of the alley, looked at her with the expression of someone running a rapid calculation and said, 2 minutes. They went in a car, 3 of them, Evelyn and the woman and a quiet man in the front seat who drove like he knew where all the exits were. Her grandfather was fine. He was exactly where she'd expected him to be, in his chair, novel open, tea cold, and when she came through the door, he looked at her with his careful eyes and said, "You look like you haven't slept." 31 hours, she said. "Sit down." "I can't." She stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at him. The particular dignity of him, the 71 years of bearing weight without being flattened by it, and felt something press at the back of her eyes that she controlled because she was not going to cry in her grandfather's doorway in the middle of a crisis. "I just needed to see you." He set down his novel. "Evie, what's happening tonight?" "Something that's been a long time coming," she said. "And I think it's going to be all right. I think he's going to make it all right." Her grandfather looked at her for a moment with the patience of a man who had learned to wait. He said. "Yes." He was quiet. Then, "Come sit with me for 10 minutes. She sat with him for 10 minutes. They didn't talk about Cassian, didn't talk about Dravik or Souls or property transfer records, or the woman waiting in the car outside. They talked about the novel he was reading, which had a detective who reminded him of someone he'd worked with 30 years ago, and about the roof, which had been silent through last night's rain for the first time in 2 winters. Small things. The furniture of an ordinary life. At the end of 10 minutes, she stood up and kissed the top of his head and left. In the car, her phone buzzed. A text from the plain cream card number. 3 words. "We're inside." Starting. She stared at the screen. Then another message, 30 seconds later, from a number she didn't recognize. No preamble, no identification. He's not the only one there. Souls brought extra. 7, not 4. Dravik sent a crew. This was a trap and he walked into it. She read it twice. Then she called the plain cream card. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She called again. 4 rings. Voicemail. Her hands were absolutely still in her lap. The quiet man in the front seat was looking at her in the rearview mirror. The woman beside her had her own phone out. "He's not answering," Evelyn said. The woman was already on her phone, speaking in low, rapid sentences to someone on the other end. She listened. Her face did something. "There's been a complication," the woman said. "I know." Evelyn looked at the screen of her phone. The Palmer Club was 6 blocks away. "How many of his people are inside?" 4. "Against 7. The woman looked at her. "Plus whoever Dravik sent," Evelyn said. Her voice was entirely level. The trembling was not present. What was present in its place was something she did not have a name for yet. Something that had been synthesized out of 31 sleepless hours, and an alley in the dark, and 14 feet of property line, and a man who had said, "Come back to her," with the specific weight of a promise. "Get me to that building," she said. "Ms. Ashcombe." "He has the documents," she said. "He has my documentation. The legal filing is prepared. Everything is ready." She met the woman's eyes. "All he needs is to still be standing when it matters. So get me to that building and tell me what I can do from the outside, because I am not sitting in a car 6 blocks away while..." The man she had come to find was still standing. The Palmer Club occupied the 4th and 5th floors of a building that had been expensive in 1920 and had maintained that expensiveness through careful renovation and careful clientele. The kind of building that absorbed money and returned it in the form of heavy doors and proper acoustics, and the particular smell of wood that had been polished for a century. Evelyn knew none of this from having been there before. She knew it from standing on the sidewalk across the street at 11:17 p.m., looking up at the lit windows of the 5th floor while the woman beside her spoke in rapid, low sentences into her phone, and the quiet man from the front seat positioned himself at the building's service entrance with the focused efficiency of someone executing a plan that had just been substantially revised. Her own phone had rung twice in the car. Not the plain cream card, not Cassian, but the unknown number that had sent the warning. She hadn't answered the first time. She answered the second. "Don't go inside," said a voice she didn't recognize. Male, middle-aged, with the careful diction of someone who had learned to speak precisely because imprecision had cost him before. "Whatever you're thinking about doing, don't go inside." "Who are you?" she said. A pause. Someone who made a significant miscalculation about how far Dravik was willing to go tonight. Another pause. Shorter. "I'm Souls." She stood on the sidewalk with December pressing in from all sides and said nothing. "I designed tonight as a negotiation," Souls said. "A demonstration of leverage. Moretti sees the property situation, understands the development is proceeding regardless of his preferences, agrees to withdraw from the downtown territory in exchange for arrangements. That was the plan." His voice was controlled, and underneath the control was something that moved like a fault line under pressure. "Dravik changed the plan. He brought people I didn't authorize, and he intends to use this room to do something I did not agree to." "Then stop him," Evelyn said. "I'm outside the building." She looked up at the fifth-floor windows. "So am I." A long pause. "You're Ashcombe?" "Yes." "You have the documentation." "It's already filed," she said. "Your title position is already compromised regardless of what happens in that room tonight. The legal filing went through 2 hours ago." She heard his breathing change, a subtle shift, barely audible, but she was listening for it. "Then this is already over," he said. "Your part of it," she said. "Dravik's part is still happening upstairs." The line was silent for 4 seconds. She counted them. "The service elevator requires a code," Souls said. 4791. "The fifth floor has a secondary exit at the north end of the main room behind the bar. It opens to a stairwell that connects to the roof access and the floor below. His people should know this." She was already turning toward the service entrance. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want this to end," he said, "in a way that leaves something standing. And because I have a daughter who is 22 years old, and I would like her to be able to look at me." He paused. "For whatever that's worth." She didn't answer that. She clicked off and broke into a run across the street. Yeah. The service elevator opened on a utility corridor that ran behind the fifth floor's main room, and she knew she had the right place because she could hear it before she reached the door at the corridor's end. Not shouting, not the sounds of violence, which was somehow more frightening than either of those. What she heard was the controlled, pressurized quiet of a room in which power was being negotiated at close range. A silence that had the specific density of many people who understood that the next several minutes would determine a great deal. The woman, her name was Petra, Evelyn had finally learned it in the car, was ahead of her, and Petra pushed through the door into the stairwell Souls had described and went up fast and quiet, while Evelyn followed and the quiet man from the car materialized from somewhere behind them, having come through a different entrance, which meant Cassian's network was already repositioning, already adapting, already working the problem with the distributed competence of people who had trained for exactly this. Through the stairwell door she could hear voices now. Cassian's was one of them. She recognized it not by some sentimental quality of knowing him. 3 weeks was not long enough for sentiment to have the kind of root she would have needed, but because she had spent 3 weeks listening to how he managed the temperature of rooms. He was managing temperature now, and from the sound of it, the room was very hot. Petra held up a hand. They stopped on the landing. The door was not fully closed. Through the gap, a wide room, mahogany and amber light, a long table with papers and water glasses, and the remnants of a presentation that had been interrupted. Around the table and along the walls, men in various postures of tension. She could see 4 of Cassian's people. She recognized their quality of stillness, had learned to read it by now, distributed around the room's perimeter, not moving, but positioned. She counted Dravik's people. 7, as the warning had said. 3 near the room's main entrance. 2 flanking a man at the head of the table, who she didn't recognize but whose posture said he was Dravik, 60s, heavy, with the bearing of someone who had spent decades being the largest force in any given space. 2 more near the windows. Cassian was standing at the center of the table, alone, without any of his people immediately adjacent, which was either strategic positioning or the result of things having moved quickly before they could regroup. He had his hands loose at his sides, and he was looking at Dravik with the expression she knew, the contained, pressurized stillness that was not calm, but looked like it from the outside. There was blood on the left side of his jaw. Not much. A cut, recent, the kind that came from a single specific impact rather than a sustained fight. Someone had hit him at some point in the last 30 minutes, and the blood had dried to a dark line along his jawbone. Evelyn looked at that line of dried blood and felt something catch in her chest and held it there, contained, because falling apart in a stairwell was not useful. The filing went through, Cassian was saying. His voice was even. 2 hours ago, Souls' title position is legally compromised on record. Every investor in this room has access to that information through public channels as of tonight. He looked at Dravik without moving his head, just a quality of attention directed. The development project is dead. Your financial position in it is dead. Whatever arrangement you made with Souls in exchange for the territory concession is dead. Dravik looked at him. You think a legal filing ends this? It ends the business logic, Cassian said. Everything else is personal, and personal is expensive and slow, and I don't think you can afford expensive and slow right now. Your Eastern operations have been under federal observation for 6 weeks. I have the documentation on that too. A shift in the room. Several of Dravik's people exchanged looks. Brief, controlled, but visible. This was information they hadn't had. You're bluffing, one of the men near the window said. I'm not, Cassian said. I've spent 2 years building a case because I don't bluff. Check your Chicago field office contacts in the morning. You'll find the observation is real and has been ongoing. He paused. Or you could do something counterproductive right now and add significantly to the evidence package. Dravik was very still. The girl, he said, is not a viable leverage point, Cassian said, and his voice on those words was flatter than anything she had heard from him. Flat the way a surface is flat when everything has been stripped from it down to the structure. She was never a leverage point. Whatever you built your plan on, that was the fundamental error. She's here, said one of the men near the main entrance. He wasn't looking at the room. He was looking at the stairwell door, the gap, the corridor of light where Evelyn and Petra had stopped. The room reconfigured. Evelyn pushed the door open and walked in. Oh, it was not a heroic entrance. She did not have a weapon or a plan or anything beyond the understanding that being visible in this room right now was better than being found in the stairwell. Because found in the stairwell was a passive position and visible in the room was at least a choice. She walked in and she stood at the room's edge and she looked at Cassian first. The dried blood on his jaw, the controlled stillness posture, the hands loose at his sides. And then she looked at Dravik, who was looking at her with the expression of a man whose tools have just rearranged themselves in an unexpected configuration. The documentation is filed, she said. Her voice carried in the room's good acoustics. The boundary discrepancy is on record. The 1792 original survey places the eastern parcel line 14 feet west of the position Souls' title claimed, 9 parcels. The legal exposure is substantial, and it is public as of 2 hours ago. She was looking at the investors when she said this. Not at Dravik, not at Cassian, at the men around the table with their water glasses and their interrupted presentation, men who had come to this room to evaluate a financial proposition and were now in the middle of something they hadn't signed up for. Every person in this room with a financial position in the development project needs to speak to their lawyers tonight, she said. Not tomorrow. Tonight. 2 of the investors stood up. The movement was quiet and immediate. The movement of men whose primary instinct is preservation of assets, who have just done a rapid calculation and reached a decisive conclusion. One of them was already reaching for his phone. Within 30 seconds, 4 of the 8 investors were moving toward the main entrance, the specific controlled urgency of people who have seen an exit and are using it while it is available. Dravik watched them go. The muscles along his jaw worked. Sit down, he said. To the investors, to the room. No one sat down who wasn't already sitting. Victor, Cassian's voice, still level, still flat, but with a quality that had changed. The temperature in it had come down, the particular drop that happens when a situation crosses from volatile to resolved. It's done. The development is gone. The surveillance on your Eastern operations is real, and the documentation I have amplifies it. Take your people and go. Dravik looked at him for a long time. It was the look of a man conducting an internal audit under extreme duress, running through scenarios, checking exits, calculating what could be salvaged and what was already gone. His eyes moved to Evelyn. She held his gaze. She did not look away, and she did not shift her weight or adjust her hands or do any of the things her body wanted to do under the specific pressure of being looked at by a man like Dravik in a room like this one. She stood still, and she looked back, and she let him see whatever he was going to see. He saw, she thought, that she was not afraid of him, which was not entirely accurate. She was afraid somewhere under the stillness. Fear was absolutely present. But fear and paralysis were not the same thing, and she had been practicing the difference for 23 years without knowing that's what she was doing. Dravik looked away first. He pushed back from the table and stood, and the movement released something in the room. His people began the slow calibration of men who are standing down but doing it in a way that preserves dignity, not running, not conceding in any language that could be named. One by one, they repositioned toward the exits. The 3 at the main entrance left first, the 2 by the windows. The 2 who had been flanking Dravik fell in behind him as he walked toward the main door without speaking again to anyone. At the door, he stopped. He looked back at Cassian. "This isn't finished," he said. "Yes, it is," Cassian said. "You just don't know it yet." Dravik left. The room breathed. Oh. Cassian was across the room in the time it took for the main door to close, and he stopped in front of her and looked at her face with an expression that had shed all its careful containment, which was more frightening and more human than anything she had seen from him yet. "You came inside," he said. "Yes. I told you to stay in the studio." "You also told me you'd come back," she said, "and your phone went to voicemail twice." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Souls called you." "Yes." She held his gaze. "He gave me the elevator code." Something moved in his face. Not surprise, he was past surprise for the night, but a recalibration, the particular adjustment of a man updating a significant file. "He wants a deal." "He wants to be able to look at his daughter," she said. Those were his words. Cassian was quiet for a moment. "That's not nothing." "No," she agreed. "It's not nothing." Petra appeared at her shoulder. "We need to clear this floor." Cassian looked at Evelyn for one more moment. The dried blood on his jaw, the quality of looking she had been cataloging, something in it that was different now, that had been altered by the specific weight of the last 40 minutes. And then he said, "Yes, let's go." They cleared the floor and the building, and they went to the secondary location, the sparse professional space where she had sat across from him 2 nights ago and listened to 2 hours of explanation, and when they arrived she sat down without being directed to, and he sat across from her without being directed to, and they were both very quiet for a while. His people moved around them. Phone calls, logistics, the ongoing work of managing what had just happened and what would need to happen next. Petra brought her a coffee she hadn't asked for, and she held it with both hands because the warmth was useful. "Your jaw," she said. He touched the cut. "Someone made an early attempt at reordering the room," he said. "Before you arrived, it was addressed. It needs cleaning. It's fine." "Cassian." He looked at her. She held his gaze. "It needs cleaning." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's a first aid kit in the back room." "I know what to do with first aid kits," she said. Dasan. She cleaned the cut in the back room with the kit she found in a cabinet above the utility sink, and it was not so different from the November night 8 months ago, except that this time she knew who he was, and this time he was sitting on a chair rather than a doorstep, and this time neither of them pretended it was an ordinary thing. He sat still while she worked. She used antiseptic and then closure strips, 2 of them, positioned the way she would position them, precisely, with the patience of someone for whom precision was not a performance but a habit. "You documented everything," he said. "That's what you asked for. You did it in 31 hours without sleeping. The work required it." "Evelyn." His voice was different in the back room, smaller in the good way, not lesser, but more interior. "You didn't have to come tonight." "You would have," she said. "If our positions were reversed." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "I would have." She smoothed the edge of the second closure strip and stepped back and looked at the result. Clean, correctly placed. He would have a small scar, probably, depending on how deep the cut went, but it would be fine. It would heal clean. "Souls," she said. "What happens to him?" He cooperates with the legal process around the title documentation, Cassian said. He withdraws from the development. His political exposure becomes someone else's problem. There are people who handle that kind of accounting better than I do. He paused. He loses his downtown position. He keeps his daughter. That seems right, she said. It's not justice, he said. It's outcome. Sometimes that's what's available, she said. He looked at her. You're not angry about the commission, about the way it was constructed. She considered this honestly. I was, she said. I am, a little, but anger at a decision made before you understood what it would cost, that has a limited useful life. She held his gaze. You told me when I asked. You didn't dress it up. I should have told you before you asked. Yes, she agreed. You should have, and you won't do it again. She said it without question because it was not a question. He looked at her steadily. No, he said. I won't. Vanessa was arrested 6 days later. The charge was conspiracy in connection with the kidnapping attempt. The two men from the alley had been identified and processed, and the chain of communication between them and Vanessa's contact in Dravik's organization was documented and substantial. Her lawyer was expensive, and the case against her was not simple, but it was real, and it moved through the appropriate channels with the deliberate pace of things that have sufficient evidence and sufficient will behind them. Evelyn was not involved in the arrest. She found out about it through a text from Cassian, 3 words, Vanessa. This morning. She read it twice, put her phone face down on the workbench, and went back to the page she was consolidating. She did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had spent 23 years on the receiving end of Vanessa's particular brand of diminishment, and she had imagined, in the abstract way you imagine the resolution of long-running things, that its ending would carry some large emotional weight, relief or satisfaction, or even grief for the family relationship that had never quite existed. What she felt instead was something much smaller and much more specific. It was close to the feeling she had when she finished a difficult restoration and closed the cover for the last time. Not triumph, just completion, the sense of a thing properly finished. She thought about what Vanessa had said in the ballroom, the family's biggest embarrassment. She tried to reconstruct the specific quality of hearing those words in a room full of people and found that the reconstruction was less vivid than it had been 2 weeks ago. Not gone. She was not the kind of person who processed damage by erasing it, but further away. Changed in its proportion to everything else. She went back to work. What? Her grandfather got the position at Heller and Cross. He went to the interview in the good coat he kept for occasions, and came home 3 hours later and put the kettle on without saying anything for several minutes, which was how she knew it had gone well. He poured 2 cups and brought them to the living room, and they sat in the chairs they always sat in, and he said, They offered it on the spot. Supply chain oversight. It's part-time to start. That's good, she said. It's very good. He turned his cup in his hands. I'm 62 years old inside a 71-year-old body, and they offered it on the spot. He looked at her. He arranged this. The obstruction was removed, she said carefully. The position opened because the person who had engineered the original refusal no longer had the leverage to maintain it. Arthur looked at her for a moment. That's a very precise way to say what you're saying. Yes, she said. Does it bother you that it happened this way? She thought about it honestly. I think about what it was before, she said. Before any of this. The roof. Your knee and the medical bills, the way we were living inside a situation that had been made smaller than it needed to be by other people's bad choices. She looked at him. I think about the fact that the position was always supposed to be yours and someone took it. And I think, yes, it bothers me that it took someone with Cassian's kind of reach to correct it. It doesn't bother me that it was corrected. Her grandfather nodded slowly. He cares about you, he said. Yes. And you? She looked at her coffee. Yes? He was quiet for a moment. Is he a good man? She thought about this with the seriousness it deserved. He's a complicated man, she said, who is trying to be better than the way he was built. She paused. I think that's the most you can honestly say about anyone. Arthur picked up his tea. Your grandmother would have liked him. he said, which was the highest form of assessment he had. But 3 months after the night at the Palmer Club, Evelyn opened the Restoration Academy. It was not a large space. A converted storefront in Wicker Park, 2 blocks from the house. With good light and a humidity system she designed herself, and 4 workstations for students, and a small library of reference materials that she had been accumulating for years, waiting for this. She had been waiting for this for longer than she had allowed herself to know. The funding came from the Reeve Commission, which had paid out in full, and from 2 subsequent commissions that had come through referrals, legitimate referrals, clients who had heard about her work from other clients, the ordinary slow accumulation of professional reputation, and from the Restoration Academy's first enrollment, which had filled its initial cohort in 11 days. She did not name the academy after anyone. She named it after the work. On the opening day, she stood in the space before the students arrived and looked at the 4 workstations with their tools laid out in order, and the reference library along the west wall, and the good light coming through the front windows onto the work surfaces. And she felt something that was not complicated and did not require careful examination. It was simple, and it was hers, and she had built it. Cassian came to the opening. He came quietly, without announcement, arriving after the students and the small group of professional guests, standing near the back of the room with his hands in his coat pockets, watching her explain the first-day orientation with the quality of attention she had learned to recognize as his most specific form of expression. When she looked at him across the room, he didn't smile. The almost smile was there, the one that had started on a terrace in December and never quite completed itself. But his eyes said something that she received without needing it translated. After the students left, she locked the front door and they stood in her workroom, and he looked at the reference library for a long time without speaking. "You built this," he said. "Yes. From the beginning. This is what you were working toward." "Since I was 19, she said. "I just couldn't see how to get here from where I was." He turned from the library and looked at her. "And now?" "Now I'm here," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. The workroom held them in its good light, the smell of paste and leather, and the specific chemical note of her work, the 4 workstations with their tools in order. All of it made and maintained by her hands over years of quiet, unwitnessed effort. "I want to show you something," he said. He reached into his coat and produced a small object, a jeweled brooch, antique. The setting worked in dark gold with a stone she didn't immediately identify, deep green and clear. He held it in his palm. "This was my mother's. It was the piece she wore more than any other. I've been carrying it for 3 months, and I can't tell you precisely why, except that I wanted you to have it." She looked at it, then at him. "Cassian," she said, "that's not a small thing to give someone." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." "You understand what you're saying when you give me something that was hers?" "Yes," he said. "I've understood it for a while. I'm only now doing something about it." She took the brooch from his palm. Its weight was surprising, heavier than it looked, the way significant things often were. The stone was a dark tourmaline, she thought, or something close to it, the color of pine needles in low light. She held it in her own palm and looked at it. "I'm difficult," she said. "I'm precise and I work too many hours, and I don't perform emotions I don't feel, and I will tell you when you're wrong." "I know," he said. "You've been wrong twice in the time I've known you." "Twice that you know of," he said. Something moved in her chest. "Fair," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I spent 9 years losing things," he said. "I spent 8 months carrying your name. I spent 3 weeks watching you restore things that everyone else had given up on." He paused. "I'm not interested in anything small." She looked at him for a long moment. In the light of her workroom, with his coat still on and the brooch in her hand and the city moving outside the front windows in its ordinary, endless way, she saw him as clearly as she had seen anything. The marks of the years on him, the pressure and the cost, the man who had said I was wrong and I'm sorry and come back, and who had sat on a client stool in her studio and taken the lesser seat without consideration. "Come for dinner Sunday," she said. "My grandfather wants to talk to you about supply chain logistics, which will be terrible for you, and then we can have a conversation about what we're actually doing." The almost smile arrived. It completed itself this time, fully, for the first time since a terrace in December, and it changed his face in a way that she suspected very few people had ever seen. Sunday, he said. She closed her hand around the brooch. Outside, Chicago moved through its late winter in the direction of spring, the light already different from December, already carrying something that wasn't quite warmth, but was the first suggestion of it, the first indication that the season was willing to change. In 6 weeks, the trees on her street would begin the slow, determined work of leafing out, doing what they did every year without drama or announcement, because that was their nature, and their nature was enough. Evelyn stood in her workroom with a brooch in her hand and thought about nothing in particular. Just stood there in the good light, in the space she had built, in the life she had not lost. That was enough. That was, it turned out, exactly enough.